You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined once again by Colin, parent of Circulate San Diego, to discuss a new report entitled The Powerless Brokers, Why California Can't Build Transit. We talk about permitting delays and reforms, public sector capacity, and giving transit authorities more authority. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Colin Parent, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for being back. Before we get started, can you tell folks who may not know you from episodes 233 and 418 a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Name's Colin Parent. I'm the CEO and general counsel at Circulate San Diego, and we're a nonprofit based in the San Diego area. We do a lot of research and advocacy around public transit, safe streets, and sustainable growth.
That's awesome. And folks, if you want more background, you can definitely go back and listen to those episodes. I highly recommend it. There's some good stuff back there. But also, since we last chatted, you ran for office. What was that experience like? What did you learn from that?
Yeah, so I had served for 2 full terms on the La Mesa City Council. La Mesa is a city of about 60,000 people, about 10 miles east of downtown San Diego. And last year I ran for the state assembly and did not succeed, but definitely got to meet a ton of people in the area that I otherwise wouldn't get to meet. Got to learn a lot about a lot of the issues that are happening in Sacramento outside of the areas where I already have some experience and expertise. And so I definitely feel like I have a broader sense of how things work. And I'm also very glad to not be on the ballot this year and being able to enjoy a little more time for other things.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it's a busy existence.
Absolutely.
What did you learn the most from people that you talked to about transportation and urban policy generally?
Yeah, I learned a lot about that, especially in my first campaign in 2016. I was going door to door a lot. I knocked on 5,000 doors in 4 months. That's just like a ton of these one-on-one conversations. And I started out, what I do for my day job is I'm a transit advocate. And a lot of the responses I got were, yeah, the trolley, boy, that sure does get in the way of me as a motorist. and so it was a good reminder that, just because transit is very important to a lot of people, it's very important to me, it's very important in the work that I do. In jurisdictions like in the San Diego area, it's about 5% of commuters rely on transit to get around. And so the vast majority of people who interact with public transit do it as a motorist. And transit can actually get in the way, or they can feel like it's getting in the way to folks. And of course, that doesn't mean that we don't support and promote public transit, but I think it's really important. This is something I try to impart to my colleagues at Circulate and to other advocates, is to really go into those conversations with that understanding. And don't just assume that everyone that you're talking to has the same priority of values and policy preferences that you do. And I think it has been helpful for me in my advocacy role. So when we're promoting public transit, we're not saying, hey, what we're trying to do is get people out of their cars and put them into transit. Instead, what we say is we want to give people real choices. so that they can choose to do that if they want. And, it's the same basic idea, but it's also, it accounts for the fact that a lot of people, wouldn't take positively to this idea that someone's trying to change their mode share. But giving them a choice is different.
Do you have the discussion with them about like using it once in a while, maybe like to go to like a baseball game or like a college football game or a soccer game or something along those lines, where it's like a trip that they would usually make in a car, but they know that it's going to be super crowded in the parking lot. So maybe this is a better way to do it. And then it gets some kind of understanding that, hey, this is something I can do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I think that fits into that choice frame too, right? It's that we want to make sure that you can have a choice to be able to take it to go to the Padres game. You want to be able to have the choice to be able to take it to a concert. And that's different than what you hear from a lot of people in the transportation and advocacy space and the professionals who will say that like what they're trying to do is for mode share and to get people out of their cars. And that sounds very appealing to people like you and me and to all of your listeners probably. But, it's just not everybody. And I think it helped temper my approach to these sorts of things so that we could communicate in a way, not to change what our policy goals were or what we're advocating for, but to do it in a way that can be internalized, can be heard by folks who may not already agree with us.
Yeah. San Diego Comic-Con just finished up. I was thinking about the last few times I've been to the convention center, and all I was doing was taking pictures of the trolley outside instead of worrying about what was going on inside.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm that nerd, right? So to maybe think about things a little differently sometimes. You guys have a report out called The Powerless Brokers, and I'm wondering what made you all put that out and put something like this together.
So we've been kind of noodling on how to do a report about transit costs for a while. And, a number of years ago, I had a colleague who wanted us to write something about that. And my kind of answer to them was, it's just too big for us, a small nonprofit based in San Diego, to really say something about it. There's folks like the Marin Center, the Transit Cost Project, doing these big multi-year long studies with, millions of dollars in budget or whatever they have. And so I just wasn't sure that we could say something about it usefully. But then we, over time, we kind of went back and forth about some of this. We got some resources put together and we ended up narrowing on a piece of the total transit costs, which is about the third party permitting, which is, honestly, maybe not, it's probably not the biggest cost driver compared to some of the other things, but it is an important one and one that has really been under examined in this public dialogue. And then concurrently, there's been some permitting reform work in the state legislature. There's a big bill, Senate Bill 445 from Scott Wiener, that's intended to do some permitting reform. And so we just thought this was a good time to weigh in on this in an area where we could carve out something that we could actually do a good job about.
Yeah, you mentioned in there the other white whales, I call them, is station size, environmental review. The Transit Cost Project does a lot of looking at those types of things. But this report, like you said, it discusses primarily pre-construction permitting processes. And so I was actually interested in this because I felt like the other topics get a lot of play in the news. It's very popular to talk about construction costs when you're talking about transit projects. Obviously, we've had this whole rigmarole going on with the Federal Transit Administration, the FRA, and the Trump administration for a high-speed rail. And so there's just like a whole bunch of stuff going on there. But then you dive down into something very particular, and I really appreciated that. So the report is actually a play off The Power Broker and Robert Caro's writing about Robert Moses. And I've also just been seeing a bit of a reassessment of that time period a little bit lately and the pendulum swing that's happened. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you kind of modeled the thinking, or at least where the starting off point is, that kind of power broker mindset, the idea that one person can do so much to, change a region or a city or a transportation project, and why that was kind of like your jumping off point.
Yeah, it's interesting. It actually wasn't our jumping off point. We were writing about this subject. We had done some outlines and some internal dialogue, done a fair amount of research around it. And the name kind of came like midway through. But it was from a couple of reasons. I mean, part of it was that there has been that re-examination, right? Mark Dunkelman's book talks about Moses a lot. Abundance talks about Moses and Moses style planning a lot. And there's sort of this growing understanding that some of the rules that we've put in place to counter the abuses of Robert Moses and Robert Moses style planning have maybe gone too far in the other direction. And so there's that. But also relatedly, it's that last year was the 50-year anniversary of The Power Broker. So there was a ton of conversation around The Power Broker as a book, and also a ton of conversation about why Robert Moses was bad and that it was good that we, addressed and stopped some of those sorts of things. So there was just a lot of that in the air, right?
Yeah, in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, exactly. And, and I think, a good chunk of our staff at Circulate listened to the 99% Invisible podcast about the power broker. So it's just very much top of mind. And then kind of the reason that we came up with the title was that I was talking with one of my colleagues. We were doing some of the research on it. And it was trying to get narrowed down, like, what can we really say about this? What's really the problem here? This is a little back and forth. I think some people on our team was a little hesitant to just really say it. But what's the problem here is just that the transit authorities don't have power. That's the problem. And it's the inverse of what Robert Moses had. Robert Moses had a lot of power and it was unchecked and there was no accountability. And then we've fast forward to where we are today, and transit authorities that we asked to build things just don't have any power to do them. And so it just seemed like, and also the other parallel being, like Robert Moses refused to build transit. He built a bunch of highways that separated communities. We recognized that was not the right thing. Now we have transit authorities that are tasked to build transit, to stitch communities together, but they don't have they have the opposite level of authority that he did. So it just made a lot of sense. The other important thing, Jeff, is that if we wrote a report titled Third-Party Pre-Construction Transit Permitting, I don't know that anyone will want to read it.
I know.
So we thought we would jazz it up a little bit with a fun name.
That's usually how it goes. I remember trying to figure out report titles and find pictures for reports and stuff that we did when I was at Reconnecting America, and it always a struggle to find something with people in it. People take pictures of transit projects and they like to take pictures of the transit, but then there's no people, or architects like to take a picture of the architecture without people. And so that doesn't work very well. And so, you have to appeal to people, right? Absolutely. When you're trying to write these reports. I do want to think about the history a little bit more about, going from Moses to now, because I think it's really interesting that this discussion has popped up again. Specifically, like we had Yoni Applebaum on the show to talk about his book, Stuck. And in that book, he talks a little bit about how there was kind of this, I guess, reevaluating some of the kind of progressive reformers after the New Deal and after Moses, which were like Jane Jacobs and Rachel Carson and Ralph Nader and others, who started the pendulum swing kind of the other way, from too powerful centralized government to almost powerlessness, which you were talking about, what the transit agencies are dealing with now. And so I'm interested in that kind of evolution as well, because I think that tells an important part of the story of how we got to where we are today and how we can start to think about how to stitch it back together from, state capacity and everything else that goes along with that.
Yeah, those are definitely themes in the report and stuff that we addressed, really right at the top. I really liked in Why Nothing Works, Mark Dunkelman describes this concept saying that there's two competing progressive policy impulses. One is Hamiltonian, and that's the idea that we want to centralize authority, give strong power to the state to do important, valuable things for the public. And then there's also this alternative, but also progressive impulse, which is Jeffersonian, which is to disaggregate power and to make sure that no one has too much power to avoid abuse. And the power broker from Robert Caro looks at Robert Moses and says this is an example of Hamiltonian central power being consolidated. And the solution to that is we need to disaggregate that in the more Jeffersonian way. And what Dunkelman argues is that both of these impulses are good and valuable, but they need to be balanced. And in the case of Robert Moses, they were unbalanced. And now we've gotten to a situation where to counter that, we've gone so far in the other direction that now we're unbalanced in the Jeffersonian disaggregated way. And so what we are in the report saying, yeah, listen, that's true. We agree. And so we do need to pivot a little bit back to the Hamiltonian direction, not all the way. We're not saying that we need to appoint someone in California to just do all the transit without any oversight. That's not what we're saying. But to recognize that we're out of balance and that we need to bring that back into balance. And I think that's a core part of some of the challenges that we have for getting the abundant public goods and services that we should expect, and transit being among them.
So we can kind of sketch this out in people's minds. What does a building process for transit look like? And what are some of the barriers that pop up when we're going through that process? And some of the barriers meaning some of the jurisdictions, the agencies, construction process, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so we included kind of a short summary of how a project gets from conception to the permitting stage. And, it's public transit agencies. In California, they're almost always elected officials. Sometimes they're directly elected. Sometimes they're representatives of local jurisdictions. They decide on a set of projects. Sometimes the voters decide on the set of projects through ballot measures. Then when they decide they're going to go ahead for them, they either do some internal planning or they hire some engineers to help them come up with a concept of the project. They go and do environmental analysis, CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, or the National Environmental Policy Act, and do all of that. Then they go and get funding, oftentimes from grants, from state and federal grants. And then they get that all together. Their board of directors says, okay, great, we've got it. We're going to approve the project. We're going to issue a request for proposals. We're going to hire a construction firm. And then now we're going to go ahead and build. And I think in the public's imagination, it's like, okay, well, they've done all that stuff. There's a whole bunch of public process involved in that, right? All being decided by elected officials, environmental review. Anyone who wants to sue on it had an opportunity to do that. Now we've settled all those things. Now it's time to build. But that's actually not how it works. So you do all that stuff. And then the transit agency says, okay, now we're ready to go build. Now they have to go through this whole new set of processes where they have to ask for permission to build from all of the different agencies and local governments and utility districts through which they want to build that transit. And so that may mean a right-of-way permit. So if a bus line wants to run across Caltrans right-of-way on the state highway system, they got to apply for a permit for that. If they want to build a station in the city that it's running in, they got to get a permit from that. If they want to do any amount of construction, they have to do a bunch of roadway closure permits and noise permits and all these other things. And there's just an enormous amount of that kind of activity. And it's not that those things are necessarily bad. Like those things should be thought through, but because it's one agency applying for this from another agency, it can create a ton of opportunities for, just bureaucratic delay, but also sometimes bad faith delay too, where you'll have a permitting agency who will hold up a project to extract something from the transit agency and drive up costs and all of that.
The exaction and extraction part is particularly frustrating. You have a couple of case studies in the report that talk about this specifically. I'm wondering if you'd tell me a little bit about those.
Yeah, so the most salient examples are around California high-speed rail. And so high-speed rail, they're conceptualizing it as a, $100 billion project. It's going to stretch, all across California. And there's a state agency that's in charge of building it. But if they want to pass through any of these small cities in the central California, they have to ask for all sorts of permissions. And one of the real stark or startling things is that you have city managers, county executives, those sorts of, leaders in these jurisdictions being incredibly transparent about how they are shaking down high-speed rail to get high-speed rail to pay for some infrastructure improvements that are really unrelated to the operation of high-speed rail. There's a variety of just like incredible quotes from some of these city managers who are saying it. There's one example actually in the Office of Inspector General for the high-speed rail report that talk about how there's this one area where the high-speed rail was planning to build some bridges over their route so that car traffic could move forward. And as a condition to do that, they also had to build bridges over an adjacent rail route that had nothing to do with high-speed rail. It's just completely crazy and an incredible expense that all of us in California are paying for, and just to the benefit of some small jurisdiction in Central California who probably doesn't want that project to happen anyway. And that's just a pretty stark example of how this mismatch between negotiating power between transit authorities and some of these permitting agencies can open things up to abuse.
The other interesting part is just the power dynamic difference between what these transit agencies in the California high-speed rail have to go up against versus what like maybe a highway agency like Caltrans would have to go up against. Do you think that like Caltrans would be requested to build a second overpass just down the road because they're building an expansion of Highway 99? Like I don't see that happening. And so it feels like transit agencies always get picked on for adding little things. And this isn't just in California, right? It's like thinking about the Phoenix light rail line and how they built that. Like they had to build from curb to curb, sidewalk, reconstruct the street and build a light rail line and do all the utility removal changes, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're asking a transit project, which is a very focused scope of work, or a high-speed rail project for that matter, and you're asking it to do all these other things that the agencies that are asking for probably would have done anyways, but they're like, hey, here's a pocket of money that we can take from that is now going to be car-oriented money instead of transit money.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a system of laws in the United States that requires State Department of Transportation to have like superior powers to the local governments through which they're building their projects. And that empowers them to like build their projects without being subject to that kind of shakedown. And we just don't empower transit agencies in the same way, or at least not consistently, but we could. And I think that's kind of what we're recommending in the report is that, and they don't necessarily have to have the same suite of powers that Caltrans has or another state department of transportation. I mean, maybe they, could or should, but the core idea is what we're saying is that, like you're pointing out, when a transportation agency has adequate power to do the things that they want to do, then they can do them. And we don't have that situation for transportation authorities. And so we should instead give them some more authority to be able to do the things that we say that we want them to do.
I think also you're very clear about saying like it should be a balance, right? And not just like that the agency should have like ultimate authority to do whatever it wants. Obviously, a lot of those permits are necessary, road closures and things like that. But I think that's an important point because I think right now what we're seeing is the imbalance.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's different ways to go about these reforms too. Like, you could have a situation where you empower a transportation agency if they want to build something, and we've gone through the process and there's been a democratic process and elected officials have voted on it. It's got CEQA review and all that other stuff that they're allowed to issue self permits. You can imagine that. It's more or less how Caltrans operates in California. We're not talking about getting rid of that, but you could also do some things that could be more modest reforms, like shot clocks. So this is something that we talked about in the report, where you could say, give the transit authority the power when they apply for a permit that a local government still gets to decide whether or not to issue the permit, but they have to decide within 60 days. And if they don't, yes or no, then the permit will be automatically issued. That's a policy that they have in Quebec for transit. It's actually a policy that already is at play for Caltrans. Caltrans has to make those determinations. If a transit agency wants to use their right of way, they have to make those determinations within 60 days. And then as a federal policy, we have a very similar policy for that, shot clocks, for telecommunications companies. So when they are coming in and trying to build some sort of infrastructure, fiber optics or something across multiple jurisdictions, they have a right to get a decision within a certain amount of time. And if the local government doesn't make the decision, then they get that permit automatically. So like this kind of system works and it exists elsewhere. It's not something that we just kind of invented and came up with. And so the kinds of benefits that we're providing to telecommunications companies, well, why not let transportation authorities who are public sector agencies have those same rights and abilities?
Yeah, and it goes to this idea of self-certification too, where I know that the state DOTs, even in Texas and California, for example, have the ability through the FHWA to self-certify their environmental impact statements, right? Which is a lot of power that maybe they shouldn't have, but they do.
Yeah.
But those kind of things like self-certification really can help them move the needle forward, because otherwise you're waiting forever for somebody higher up, which may not have the capacity to do such a thing, to do it. And, that goes into another question about state DOTs and capacity and what the capacity level of transit agencies and California SP Rail for that matter, versus what the state DOTs have at their disposal.
Yeah, no, that's right. And we made some recommendations about what we wanted to see from Caltrans, the State Department of Transportation in California. And, one of the things that we put in there, echoing some recommendations from our partners at Spur in the Bay Area from a prior report that they published, was let's have Caltrans provide more of a technical assistance role for transit projects, especially for the agencies and jurisdictions that are too small to have that kind of in-house expertise. And that's actually one of the challenges that we see in this space, is that sometimes, some transit agency or LA Metros, your Sandags in San Diego, these big agencies, they have all these experts and staff who understand how transit works and all that. And they're trying to get a permit from some small jurisdiction who's never had a transit project coming through them. And their public works director just has absolutely no expertise in this. And that's not their fault, right? That's just a factor of scale. And so, having a resource in the form of Caltrans to help navigate those things for smaller jurisdictions is, I think, one thing that agency could do. And it's very much in line with the governor's executive order about asking interagency coordination to help facilitate transit and other public infrastructures.
We had Adi Tomer from Brookings on a few weeks ago, and what we were talking about is basically how much money that regions and cities generate for the federal government, and then how much goes back to the states. And so the regions and cities don't actually get back. It's like I can't remember the numbers exactly. We talked about it on the show. It's like 8% back versus like the 32% that they generate or something along those lines. There's a gap. And so it seems to me that Caltrans should be the one that kind of takes this mantle on because they do have this excess funding that should be going to cities but doesn't. They have that capacity that exists to do all the environmental impact statements for all the roads and stuff that they do. The regions don't have that. And so it seems like there's some way for Caltrans and other state DOTs to step in and do a lot of this stuff that, the reason why these transit agencies and others can't do it is because they don't have the money, but the money goes to the state DOTs. So maybe they can pull up the slack because they already have the money that they should be giving to the cities and states.
So that makes a lot of like intuitive sense to me too. But when you talk to a lot of other advocates for transit in California, you talk about empowering Caltrans to take a larger role in transit planning. They usually go, "Oh no, that's a terrible idea. Caltrans is really against transit, and we want to minimize their involvement in these sorts of things." And so I'm not sure that either of those are necessarily the right, answer to that. I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think you want to see Caltrans reformed and have a greater interest in advancing public transit. And there's been some efforts in that in this administration and the prior administration. In fact, there's a director's policy that's in a draft form about allowing for this and to implement some recent state laws related to this subject that, hopefully will make some progress. But it is also true that there is like a legacy and history of Caltrans not being always a useful partner in these transit projects. And so it's a tough one, right? I think we want to see Caltrans be a better partner for transit, and they're trying, they're trying. But also maybe we want the driver of transit to be the agency that's most committed to that. And that's generally not Caltrans.
I guess in my mind, I'm thinking about Caltrans as a general kind of idea rather than the agency as it exists right now, right? You have these regional offices and you have CalSTA and other agencies and California High-Speed Rail Authority and things like that. But it feels like we do need some type of increased capacity for building projects, for having expertise and understanding. And so if we're going to do big projects around the state and even around the country, but if we didn't do big projects around the state of California, which is a huge state, why can't we set up an office of transit that actually has the expertise to build these projects? We know we need capacity to do it. We can't depend on the consulting firms to do it all for us. We should have that capacity. And that's something that the Cost Project has talked about, I think, a little bit too. Mm-hmm. But, maybe it's something like that where the agency creates a sub-agency, or maybe there's a specialist inside. Because I agree with you. I don't think that folks who are advocates for transit would really appreciate Caltrans as it exists now to jump in, because they have shown in the past that they're not really interested in the outcomes that transit advocates are. But at the same time, that capacity issue is a really big one.
I think that's totally fair. And I'm not convinced that just because Caltrans hasn't been always a good ally doesn't mean that they couldn't be, right? Mm-hmm. Or it doesn't mean that we shouldn't demand that from them, give them the resources to do that, that sort of thing. It is funny when you talk about some big reforms, and especially on the state level, people will decide, like it may make sense on sort of like an intellectual level to assign some power to some agency.
Yeah.
But then oftentimes people go, yeah, of course that makes sense, like on paper, but have you ever met anyone at that agency? Like they're not on board, and so it's interesting. It's not always obvious where you should assign these sorts of powers and authorities. But yeah, that being said, I think there's good reasons to expect more from Caltrans. They're moving in some of those directions. And I haven't all given up on Caltrans being a better ally on those things and being, potentially more in the driver's seat. But I also temper that sense with, it's really not Caltrans who's building the big heavy rail projects in LA. It's not Caltrans who's doing the Midcoast extension in San Diego. They're not doing the BART projects into San Jose. It's actually these regional transit agencies, transportation agencies that have both the expertise and the political interest in getting these projects done.
Yeah, don't get me started on San Jose.
Yeah.
It's like a can of worms there. Another thing that the state DOT is the standards, right? Construction standards. You mentioned this in the report as well. Design standards, those types of things. Sometimes those match what the cities are after, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, to my mind, this is like the easiest reform to be implemented politically. Right now, transit agency wants to build something. They have to go to the jurisdiction in which they want to build it and submit their engineering documents and try to get a building permit. And they may have 4 or 5 or 12 different design standards that they have to meet depending on which segment of their project is in which jurisdiction. And that is just like an extra layer of complication. And those standards themselves, may actually be really similar, but the jurisdictions want to review them as though they're different, and they want to review them from scratch and all this other stuff. And so it just creates this incredibly complex, unnecessarily complex system. And it just isn't the case. It just isn't the case that the city of Encinitas has really different engineering needs. Like the laws of physics are not different there than the city of Chula Vista. Like it just like that just doesn't make any sense. So I think there's an opportunity to see either region-wide or statewide standards for these kinds of projects. And this is an area where I think Caltrans could absolutely play a role. So Caltrans has these standards for how local governments' streets connect to the highway system. And that's a statewide standard. All cities have to abide by them. And they're like, they're basically used to it. There's no grousing about it, right? And I think you could easily imagine Caltrans or some other state agency, if you're scared about Caltrans, that's fine. You can find someone else to do it, to identify what these design and engineering standards ought to look like, promulgate them, and to require all jurisdictions to abide by them. And I think that would just reduce a substantial amount of friction and confusion between public agencies without limiting their ability to review those projects or to approve or deny them, but just to require everyone to abide by the same standards.
It always makes me think about like why we have so many jurisdictions in the first place. And I understand why, because when we developed as a country, it took a day to walk between cities, but now it doesn't. So a lot of these jurisdictions, they seem like they should be one organization rather than 50. I mean, you've mentioned in the report the 27 agencies in the Bay Area, and we have this discussion all the time. Some people like that idea and don't, but there are a lot of jurisdictions that you have to go through, and it would be good to have state standards that match. And we can argue also about, whether there are car-oriented standards or transit-oriented standards as well, right? So it's a good point to be had.
Well, the other thing just to point out about that is that like the politics of consolidating agencies or politics of consolidating jurisdictions is very hard.
Yeah,
right?
Of course.
Like there's elected officials who are not going to want to give up their powers. Neighborhood groups don't want to see their power diluted, that sort of stuff. So those things are genuinely hard. And we're not recommending in this report to do all that. Whether or not, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not. We're not touching that one. Okay.
Yeah. That was me. Me.
Yeah.
I'll take that.
Yeah. Jeff, everybody. But when we're talking about consolidating or using the same engineering standards across jurisdictions, like I've been in local politics a long time. I've never met anyone who ran for mayor saying that I'm going to run for mayor so that I can preserve our public works department's ability to use the APWA's book as opposed to the green book from no one cares about that in politics. So like these are things that, there's people who care about it, like public works directors care about it, right? But I think these are the sorts of institutional political opposition that could be overcome in service of making things better for the broad majority of the public.
Yeah. I recommend folks go back and listen to the discussion we had with Bill Schultes about the AASHTO Bike Guide and the NACTO Bike Guide, maybe a month ago or so. Really interesting discussion about the processes and stuff for that. So what were some of the things that were good? Like, I feel like there was a positive. Some of them were negative, obviously, like Wasco and some of the high-speed rail examples. But then you're pretty positive on what happened with the Midcoast trolley extension.
Yeah, so we did 4 different case studies in the report about transit projects that were facing some big permitting challenges. But one of those 3 was the Midcoast, which is a trolley extension from San Diego, extending the existing light rail line that used to run only from the San Ysidro border to downtown and extending that all the way up the coast to the UC San Diego campus. And that project was opened in 2021. The project sponsor was SANDAG, that's the San Diego Association of Governments. It's the transportation agency for the region. And it was all within the city of San Diego. And that project got done pretty fast and in the permitting process and didn't face a ton of surprises or complications. And it's not that it had zero. There were some, but this was a contrast to some of the other projects that we had profiled where those third-party agencies were really getting in the way of those projects. And so we attributed this for a couple of reasons. One is that San Diego has a relatively collegial environment between staff and elected officials on these transportation projects. In part, that's because there are just fewer agencies. So San Diego doesn't have 27 operators, it has 2. And the Bay Area has like 9 counties, San Diego has 1. And so there's just fewer entities, fewer staff people who have to know each other to be able to get things going. So that's one. And then the other big one is that SANDAG as an agency has some powers, some statutory powers that not every transportation authority enjoys. So, for example, SANDAG does not have to follow the zoning or building code decisions of the jurisdictions through which it's building its projects. A lot of other transit agencies have that in California, but not all of them. And then additionally, SANDAG has the authority to use the right-of-way of any jurisdiction in its boundaries. So any public agency that has a right-of-way, SANDAG can make use of it. And so some examples of why that's mattered, I'll give you a building code example. So SANDAG wanted to build a parking garage for its Midcoast riders. And, I know I'm not always the fan of building that, but they wanted to build it. There was some funding reasons. Let's put aside whether or not they ought to have built it. But they wanted to build it. It was important for them for their project. The city of San Diego would not give them the building permit for some esoteric reasons. And so SANDAG said, okay, well, we're going to adopt the state of California's building code and we'll appoint a building official and we'll ask them to issue the permit. And they did. And so they had the authority to do it. They didn't wait on the city and they just did what they had to do. Followed all the laws. Parking garage is still there. It's fine, And that's just an example of how if you have some authorities and use them, you can get through some of these challenges and not get tied up for years.
Can this be extrapolated to other states?
I think so, yes. I think the situation in California is not different than others, right? Transit authorities do not have the same powers that State Department of Transportations do for highways. And they get tied up in permit applications all the time. And the fractured nature of a lot of local governments in California is maybe more so than some other places, but it's pretty common. And so a lot of the reforms, a lot of the challenges that transit authorities are facing in California are being faced elsewhere too. And so that also, the solutions in California are also going to be the solutions elsewhere as well.
If you had one thing that folks would take away from the report, what would it be?
I think the biggest thing is that we should be empowering transit authorities to do the things that we say that we want them to do. That's very much an abundance answer, right? That's an answer that says if we think that government is good and that can do good things and we want it to do good things, and so we should give it the power to do that, as opposed to constantly undermining it and then being surprised that we're not getting what we want out of it.
And then is there something that surprised you about the process for researching this report?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, I guess I was surprised digging into the SANDAG example to understand more completely some of the powers that the agency has, and that those things really did matter and were able to be used to speed along a project. But notably, too, just because the transit authority has that power doesn't mean that they use it, right? They may have political constraints. So give that example again of that parking garage. Their first inclination was to apply for a permit from the city of San Diego, right? As opposed to just doing it themselves. And so I think that suggests that you can provide a lot of these authorities to these transit agencies, and it sort of suggests two things. One is that they might be able to supersede and get through some barriers, but it also means that they are politically constrained, right? City of San Diego has the biggest vote on the SANDAG board. And so you wouldn't expect SANDAG to just plow through the city of San Diego if it was, a hot issue for the city. But that actually should hopefully give people some comfort with the idea of providing more authority to these transit agencies, because they're not going to just plow through things like Robert Moses did, because they're much more politically accountable than predecessor agencies.
Yeah. There was a report from Iona Freemark recently, which said something similar, which is you still have to depend on local folks and local agencies and local political connections to get some of these things done, because otherwise you're, cutting off the hand that feeds you and cutting off your nose to spite your face and those types of things. So It is important from a political standpoint, because if you want to keep doing these projects, you have to make sure everybody's fairly happy, even if you have to do a couple of things that you need to do to get the project going.
Absolutely.
Where can folks find the report?
It's on our website. That's circulatesd.org and then /Powerless Brokers. And if you Google the Powerless Brokers, it's definitely going to be the top response.
And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I'm on a lot of social media at Colin Parent, Twitter and Instagram and what have you. I think there might be a dead TikTok account, but don't expect any new content there.
I totally understand. Colin, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.